Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going to be going through my favourite books of 2022, and I'm going to start by saying I promise I tried to narrow this down to a top 10, but it just wasn't happening, so I decided let's not do that, let's do a top 14 instead, randomly. It does make sense, I promise, because basically I went through the main genres that I read and I picked out my top 3 fantasy books, my top 3 romances, my top 3 thrillers, and then my top 5 everything else. And then there's also 2 other books that have got honourable mentions. So really, basically, I'm gonna be talking about 16 books in this video. I hope that's okay. But yeah, I also haven't put these in any particular order because, again, that was too stressful. Basically, I wanted to make this video as chill as possible. I wanted to just sit down and have a chat about some books that I really loved this year, and I wanted to make things as easy for myself as possible. I will leave timestamps in the description just in case you would like to skip ahead at any point if there are any particular books that you're interested in, but I'm going to start with some honourable mentions. So I have here The Mad Ship by Robin Hobb, which is the second book in the Live Ship Traders trilogy, and then I also have Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee, which is book 3 in the Greenbone saga. I talked about both of these quite recently in my series wrap-up video, which I'll leave linked up above and in the description. These were my favourite books within those series, so I wanted to mention them, but I didn't want to include them in the main list because I can't really recommend reading these unless you've read the other books in the series, but they were favourites. I did really love these and I gave them both 5 stars. I think it actually makes sense to continue by talking about the fantasy books on my list, and the first book I wanted to talk to you about is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I don't think it's a surprise that this book is on this list because this is one of my favourite books of the year. I loved how cosy this was and how adorable the characters were. We're basically following this main character called Vivian, who's an orc, and she decides that she doesn't want to be a warrior anymore. She decides to give it all up to open a coffee shop in this city that has never heard of coffee, and it's very slice of life. It's very cozy. We're following Viv and also these side characters as they navigate this journey to opening this coffee shop, and the found family in this was so cute. I thought it was so well written and I just fell in love with it. It's one of those books that just gave me that warm, cozy feeling, and I'm sure I cried as well, not because it was sad, but because I was just so overwhelmed by how much I was loving it. There's also a really adorable sapphic romance that develops throughout the story that isn't the focus of the story, but I did also really enjoy that. Even if you don't usually read fantasy, I think I would still recommend this. It's high fantasy, but with low stakes. So even though there is a conflict in this, it's not like overly graphic or stressful. It is more about the characters, and it's very slice of life. I might have said that already. It is a standalone, but I know that Travis Baldree is also writing other books within this world, and I am so excited for them. I don't actually know when the next book comes out. I know it is going to be a companion novel, and I think the title was released recently, but I can't remember what it is. Either way, you can guarantee that I will be reading it as soon as it comes out because I just loved this book. It was an easy 5 stars. The next fantasy standalone on my list is Babel by R.F Kuang. So this was a very hyped release for 2022 and I really enjoyed it. I gave it 5 stars. However, it's not a book that I would recommend broadly because I think it all depends on what your personal preferences are, but this was marketed as a fantasy book, and while I did love the fantasy elements and the magic system and the world building, I think I would recommend this more for its themes. It felt like a historical novel with fantasy aspects. We're basically following this main character called Robin, who's given this opportunity to go to Oxford University. I think it's set in 1836, and basically within this alternative reality there are these bars, these silver bars, which are what powers the British Empire. I don't want to say too much because one of my favourite things about this book was learning about the magic system. Basically Robin is given this opportunity to go to Oxford ordered to learn how to create these silver bars and master the art of silverworking. I loved the way that the themes were explored in this book, and I loved the dark academia atmosphere and the general plot and the magic system and the world building. The main criticism that I had was that I didn't like the character work. I felt like there was a lot of telling and not enough showing, but because I loved everything else, I did give it 5 stars. You could also tell how much passion R.F Kuang has for language and translation. That really came across in the writing. It was impeccably researched, in my opinion, and I love that. I love when I can tell that an author has done their research and when they have this natural passion for what they're writing about. I really loved that aspect as well. So yeah, I had conflicting feelings on this, but ultimately it is a book that has stuck with me. The final fantasy book on my list is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. So I have read quite a few books by Brandon Sanderson and I have generally enjoyed them, but I think this is actually one of my favourites, which I wasn't expecting considering this is one of his earlier books. I think this might have actually been his debut, but I loved how political this was. So basically this is set in a world where there used to be this city called Elantris, and within Elantris lived these demigods who used to be ordinary people, but they would wake up randomly and find that they'd been turned into a demigod. I don't want to over explain this because it's quite complicated, but basically at some point in the past magic turned bad, and so now you have something called the Sheod, which is like a disease or a curse. These people are thrown into Elantris and quarantined off, and so it's a very different world to how it used to be, and we're following a few different characters, but the main character that we're following, I guess, is called Prince Raoden, and he wakes up one morning to find that he's been affected by the Sheod and he's thrown into Elantris, and his father the king tells everyone that he's died, which causes problems because he was engaged to be married and his wife is from a different country, but she arrives to this city to find that she's now a widow. There's also another perspective of this guy called Harathan, who's a priest, and so there's also religious elements throughout this story. I just thought it was really well done. I thought that the build-up was really well executed, and I love the way that Brandon Sanderson is able to surprise me, but everything still feels completely logical. Moving on to romance, and the first book I wanted to talk about is 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. So I was surprised by how much I loved this book because it's a second chance romance, and that isn't a trope that I usually enjoy, but the reason I don't usually enjoy it is because if two characters were together in the past and they're not anymore, usually I agree with the reason why they broke up, and so I struggle to root for them in the present day. However, I didn't find that with this book. We're basically following two main characters who are both authors. They originally met when they were teenagers and had this whirlwind relationship that lasted for 7 days. However, things didn't work out, but they've never forgotten about each other, and they've both been writing each other into their books, not in an explicit way. It's more that the other person has influenced characters or aspects of their writing, and I just thought that this was such a beautiful love story. I thought that the main characters had great chemistry, and I completely understood the reasons why things didn't work out the first time around, and so I was really rooting for them to get together. There's also chronic pain rep as well. One of the main characters has migraines, which isn't something that I've ever read about before, so I really appreciated that. It was just such a beautiful love story. I don't know how else I can explain it. It was very emotional and the characters felt very real. I also, in general, just love books that are about books or that are about authors or that are about the publishing industry, and I thought that the plot that was happening alongside the romance was also done really well. It was really well balanced, but this was definitely a love story and I really enjoyed it. I think I gave it 4 stars at the time because I did have a few issues with the pacing, but it is a book that I keep thinking about and that I actively want to recommend. So I think I need to change my rating to 5 stars. It definitely deserves 5 stars. The next 2 books that I wanted to talk about are technically part of the series, but they're written to be companion novels, so you don't have to read them in order. You can read them as standalones, but they are Delilah Green Doesn't Care and Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail by Ashley Herring Blake. I loved both of these. I gave them both 5 stars, and I think I'm going to start with Delilah Green Doesn't Care because this is the first book in the series and it's the first book that I read. This follows a main character called Delilah Green, which you can probably guess from the title, but Delilah is a photographer living in New York and she has a very complicated relationship with her stepmom and her stepsister. They never really got along when they were kids. However, her stepsister Astrid is now getting married and she's asked to be the photographer for the wedding. So she travels back to her hometown, which is this small town called Bright Falls, which I loved. I love small town settings within romance books. And on her first evening, she goes to this bar and she runs into Claire. So Claire is one of Astrid's best friends. Her and Delilah do know each other. They've known each other since they were teenagers and they've always had crushes on each other. However, they've never acted on those feelings. Claire was in a relationship and she also now has a young daughter. However, they're now both single and sparks start to fly. So it's about their budding relationship, but it's also about them trying to stop this wedding because they don't believe that this guy is the right person for Astrid. Delilah Green is one of my favourite fictional characters of the year. I loved how witty she was and I loved her relationship with Claire's daughter Ruby. I thought it was so adorable and just in general I loved the humour in this book. I also thought it had a really well developed side plot alongside the romance. If you're looking for a sapphic romance that also has a lot of steam, then I would recommend this one. I loved it. I didn't think that anything could beat this out to be my favourite romance of the year. And then I read Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail, and I will say I didn't feel as invested in the romance in this book in comparison to Delilah Green. However, I really loved this book as a whole. We're basically following a main character who's discovering their sexuality for the first time, and it was quite emotional in places. I wish I had a highlighter so I could highlight certain passages because wow, it's not often that a romance book can make me cry, but this made me feel quite overwhelmed at times. I really loved the characters in this. I thought that Astrid Parker in particular was a really interesting character because she knows that she's not the most likeable, but she doesn't want to be that way, and just being inside her head was such an experience. I just loved both of these books and I'm so excited for the 3rd book in the series, which follows Iris. Yeah, just in general, I loved how these characters were flawed, but there was something still charming and endearing about them. I just love this series so much. I bought the physical copies, which I don't do that often because I'm pretty sure I'm going to want to reread these at some point. Moving on to my favourite mystery thrillers of the year, and I think I'm going to start with 3 Hours by Rosamund Lupton because I think this probably was my favourite thriller of the year if I had to pick just one. I really loved the atmosphere and the tension in this, and something that I'm learning is that when it comes to mysteries and thrillers, I tend to prefer quieter stories that are less about the action and more about an interesting plot and interesting characters. Sometimes I am really in the mood for a fast-paced thriller, but this was slow. It was so interesting. Basically, this is set in Somerset in the UK, and we're following this hostage situation at this school. So it is quite emotional at times. We're basically following all of these characters that are within this situation, and it's all about taking you inside the minds of these characters and what they're feeling. And I could feel their anxiety and their fear. I read this so quickly because I couldn't put it down. I needed to know what was going to happen. There were some twists and turns, some of which I didn't see come in, but also, like I might have said, the atmosphere in this was 10 out of 10. I think it takes place in winter when it's snowing, and I felt like that just added to that isolated setting. It was so well written, in my opinion. I really want to read more books by this author. I think this is her most popular book, but I would be interested in finding more because I really loved this. Because this is about a school shooting, I know that it's not a book that everyone would want to read. However, I think that if you are interested in the plot, then I would recommend giving it a go because I did think it was really well written. The next book on my list is The It Girl by Ruth Ware. So I don't actually own a physical copy of this because I read it on my Kindle. I think I actually read an arc of it through NetGalley, so I either read it around the time that it came out or just before, but I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a very clever mystery and I really enjoyed Ruth Ware's writing. I thought the atmosphere was done really well, but I have seen this on quite a few people's worst books of the year list, so take my opinion with a pinch of salt. Basically, this follows a main character called Hannah who, when she was at university, she had this best friend and roommate called April who was murdered before the end of their first year. In the present day, Hannah has tried to move on with her life. She's now married and she's pregnant. However, she learns right at the start of the book that the guy who was convicted of April's murder has just died in prison, and a journalist comes forward and claims that they have new evidence that suggests that this guy wasn't responsible, which Hannah is confused about because it was her testimony that put this guy in jail in the first place. So it's all about this main character trying to uncover the truth behind what happened back then, and you do have a split timeline. You follow Hannah in the present day and also in the past. I think I personally preferred the past timeline because it had that university setting, and I did feel like I was transported to Oxford University. I did think that the atmosphere was done really well. I completely understand why a lot of people didn't like this one because it is very slow, and I do think it could have been around 50 pages shorter, and that would have really helped with the pacing because it dragged quite a lot in the middle. However, as a mystery, it had everything that I wanted. It had twists and turns, and I liked that the characters were interesting, even though they were unlikable. The final thriller on my list is Runtime by Catherine Ryan Howard. So I really enjoyed this book, but it doesn't have the best ratings on Goodreads. I think it has something like a 3.5 star average rating, which I'm really surprised at. Like, I understand why some people didn't like this book, but I'm really shocked that it has such a low average rating because I really enjoyed this. I thought the tension was done really well and it made me feel so anxious. Like, I stayed up quite late reading this and I had to make myself put it down because I knew I wouldn't sleep otherwise. It basically follows a main character called Adele who used to be a soap star in Ireland. However, something happened and she basically ran away to Los Angeles, where she's now struggling to find work. So she's about to give up on acting when she gets this phone call from a producer back home asking her if she'd like to be the lead in this movie because the actress that they had hired had to drop out last minute. So she gets on this plane and flies over to the middle of nowhere in the Irish countryside to be the star of this horror movie. And I really liked the way that this book was told because you have Adele's perspective, but you also have chapters from the screenplay. So you're basically seeing the movie that Adele is shooting. It's like a movie within a book. I don't want to say much more because honestly, the tension and the suspense in this book was so scary. Like, it's not often that I read a book that actually terrifies me. I could feel the anxiety that Adele was feeling because basically when she arrives, she finds that she's the only woman on this film set, and I just felt everything that she was feeling. I kept thinking about how I would feel if I was in her situation, and I just think that as an isolated thriller, this did everything that it should have done. I do think it's a book that's more about the journey rather than the ending. So if you're the kind of reader who, if you don't like the ending to a book, then it ruins the whole book for you, then maybe I wouldn't recommend this one. I actually didn't mind the ending. Considering that it's, I think, over 500 pages, I read it in, I think, less than 24 hours because it was so compelling, I couldn't put it down. Okay, so if the camera angle has changed slightly or if the lighting looks different, it's because I took a little break to recharge my camera battery, but I am back to talk about my favourite books that don't fit into any other of the previous 3 genres. So there's 5 books that I'm going to talk through in this next section. The first is a sci-fi, and it's actually one of the first books that I read this year. It's Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I read this literally at the start of January and I loved it. I couldn't believe that I'd found a new favourite book within the first few weeks of the year. I loved this. It was a lot cozier than I was expecting. We're basically following this main character called Ryland, who wakes up in space with no memory of how he got there. So there's that mystery where his memory is gradually coming back to him, and this is a person trying to save the world type story. I think that's the best way to describe it without spoilers. But the way that the plot unfolded, I really enjoyed it. I know that a lot of people recommend reading this via audio. I read it physically and I still really enjoyed it. I think if I was to ever reread this book though, I would listen to the audio because I have just heard amazing things about it. So yeah, this was my first 5-star of 2022, I think, and I would recommend it even if you don't usually read science fiction. Some of the technical stuff went over my head, but Andy Weir does have this ability of making you feel like you're still following everything and you're still understanding what's going on. This was so cute and so wholesome. It made me cry and I just loved it so much. The next book on my list is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. So this is one of the few classics that I've read this year. I think it's considered a classic. It was published in the 1970s and the present day timeline actually in this is also set during the 1970s. We're following this main character called Dana, who's a black woman living in the 1970s, but she keeps getting pulled back in time to the 1800s, I think it is. Yeah, the past timeline is set in 1815, and the first time that she gets pulled back in time, it's to save this little boy from drowning, and then it keeps happening. Most of this book does take place within the past timeline, so even though there's that scientific element because it involves time travel, it felt more like a historical novel. Because Dana is a black woman, in order for her to survive in the 1800s, she has to pretend to be a slave, and I thought this was so powerful. The writing is quite distant, but at the same time I just felt so immersed in the story, and there were all of these horrifying things that were happening, but it was told in a very matter-of-fact way. Parts of this felt like a horror novel, and I really appreciated the way that this blended so many different genres. Ultimately though, this is a story about life on this plantation and it's about these characters. It's a very character-driven novel. I could feel the main character's fear and her anxiety, and it was so fascinating. It's unlike any other book that I've ever read, and I keep thinking about it. At the time, I gave it a very high 4 stars, almost a 4.5, but I think this should be a 5 stars. It's a book that I feel like I can recommend to a lot of people, and I think even if you don't usually read classics or historical fiction or literary fiction, then I think that you would still get a lot out of this book. Next on my list is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. So I believe that this was originally self-published and then it was picked up by a publisher and published again this year. I'm pretty sure I read an arc of it through NetGalley. I know I read it on my Kindle because I don't own a physical copy, but I really enjoyed this. I wasn't sure what to expect because all I knew was that it was horror and that it was about one of Dracula's brides. Basically, this woman is writing a letter to this man who you know is Dracula, but he's never actually mentioned by name within the book. I don't know what else I can say about the plot. It's basically about their life together, and it's about the people that he introduces to their relationship. This is poly, so I wanted to mention that because I don't think I've read many books that have a poly rep, but I really liked the way that the relationships within this book were developed. I thought that the characterization was done really well. The atmosphere was also exactly what I wanted from a vampire book, and it, yeah, surprised me. I started reading this and I'm pretty sure I finished it within 24 hours, which I wasn't expecting because it is a very descriptive writing style. I don't usually like a second person point of view, but I think it really worked in this book. It took me a few chapters to get used to the writing style, but I liked how this book felt like therapy for the main character. It felt like she was going through this very therapeutic experience of offloading all of her thoughts and feelings, and I really liked the way that that was done. Next on my list is Sundial by Catriona Ward. So this is another horror novel. I feel like I read more horror this year than I usually do, but I really enjoyed this. I think I enjoyed this more than The Last House on Needless Street, which I read last year by Catriona Ward. There's not much that's given away within the plot. It's basically about this woman who takes her eldest daughter back to the place where she grew up. So she grew up within this community in the desert, but for some reason she suspects that there's something wrong with her eldest daughter that means that they have to go back there. And I don't want to talk about the plot too much because something that I think Catriona Ward does really well is she places you into the story and then she gives you enough information so that you can follow what's happening and you can enjoy the atmosphere, but she delivers the twists and the reveals quite gradually. So you have to spend a lot of time just trusting the process. And I've seen some negative reviews from people who don't like that because it is quite frustrating. This is a book that's mostly about the journey, and I really enjoyed the journey to get to the ending. I thought that the atmosphere was done really well, and I liked how there was a past timeline and a present day timeline. I found the past timeline really interesting, but I also liked the way that everything was wrapped up. There's also a really interesting and complicated sister relationship within this book, which I really enjoyed reading about because I have sisters, and so I love seeing that dynamic within books. I did want to give a content warning for animal abuse and also experiments on animals. That is quite a significant part of the book, and even though I didn't enjoy reading about it, I did think that it was interesting the way that that was incorporated into the plot. This definitely felt more like a horror rather than a thriller, which I think is what it's categorised as. To be fair, it did feel more about the exploration of these horrifying things that were happening, even though there were also still quite a few thrilling moments as well. The final book on my list is actually the only non-fiction book on my list, and that is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, which I feel like this is popping popping up on quite a few people's favourites of the year, but I really enjoyed this. I mean, enjoy is probably the wrong word, but I listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Jeanette McCurdy, and it was really powerful. There were times where I could hear the emotion in her voice, and it was making me feel emotional. For anyone who doesn't know, Jeanette McCurdy was a child star. I think it was iCarly and Sam and Cat. Those were the shows that she was on. I never watched either of them, but I still really appreciated how she spoke so openly about everything that she went through. Her mom basically forced her into acting when it wasn't really what she wanted to do, but she also wanted to make her mom happy, and it was so heartbreaking at times. I cried while listening to this. It was one of the best memoirs that I've ever read, and even if you never watched any of the shows that she was on, I would still recommend it if you're interested in getting the perspective of someone who was a child star in Hollywood. Okay, so I think that's the end of the list. I'm really hoping I haven't missed any books by accident, but those were the top books that I read this year. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of them and if they were also favourites for you. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and click subscribe if you would like to see more videos from me, but otherwise I will see you next time. Bye!